On this evening's Nationwide, we mark two of the last major episodes of the War of Independence. We'll meet one woman whose grandfather, a policeman, was killed in an ambush in Kerry, and the grandson of the man who killed him. And we travel to Mayo to hear how one IRA commander refused to kill captured RIC officers. This is Mary O'Neill and this is Dermot Cotter. They don't really know each other, in fact they've only recently met. Their lives, however, are inextricably linked by what happened on a warm summer's day on June the 1st, 1921, on the road from Milltown to Castlemaine in County Kerry. That was the day when Dermot's grandfather, Jerry Unkie O'Connor, part of an IRA ambush group, threw the grenade that killed Mary's grandfather. Both the attackers and some of the ambushed came from the same community. This is a story of how the extreme violence of the War of Independence reached deep into local communities only weeks before that war ended.
The 12 RIC and Black and Tans were cycling from their barracks in Killorglin to Tralee to collect their pay. And the reason they were cycling is because one of the activities that the IRA stepped up at the beginning of 1921 was the cutting of trenches in roads, which made it impossible for the Crossley tenders and four-wheeled vehicles to pass by. So that explains why District Inspector McCaughey and his men were cycling to Tralee. But of course, whereas the bicycle provided an easier mode of transport, it also brought inherent dangers and offered no protection whatsoever.
Thomas O'Sullivan's father, Totty, was at school in Milltown when, upon hearing gunfire and explosions through the open windows, a priest uttered the following words.
Lads, go home. There's trouble over the road. I go home straight away. And of course, most of the school did. But my father and his friend, Denny Shucker, hightailed it to where the action was. He said, I saw the upturned bicycles and the dead soldiers of the RIC and Black and Tans on the roadway. And then he says the sense of smell, and it was like the after smell of the gunfire. That was kind of prominent in his head, you know.
Apart from the fact that the patrol used a dangerously regular route, what's perhaps most surprising about the ambush is that the RIC senior officer, Inspector Michael McCaughey, was apparently warned in advance.
I think that's one of the most intriguing aspects of the story. When the police group cycled out from Tralee, they stopped in Castlemaine in the village for a drink at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And while there, District Inspector McCaughey received a tip-off, not just from a number of local civilians who were unsympathetic to the IRA, but also from the railway station master from Killorglin, who happened to have passed by and had noticed IRA activity. And District Inspector McCaughey was told to, quote, look out on the road to Milltown, that the IRA had been seen in the vicinity, that there was activity locally, and that an ambush was likely in the offing. It's quite extraordinary that despite this information that McCaughey continued to lead his 12 men onwards to return towards their barracks. And according to accounts, he told his men that I will not turn off my road for any shinners.
Cycling next to Inspector McCaughey was RIC Sergeant James Collery, a father of 8 children who lived in nearby Milltown. Mary O'Neill is his granddaughter.
You know, I think my mother remembered the bodies being brought back to the church that evening, and she remembered this is one of her vivid memories that she was always very sad about, I suppose, that she remembered her father's body on the back of the cart with the blood on the cart and the bodies being brought into the church. So she was 11 years old at the time, so it was a very vivid memory that stayed with her, and I suppose something she never ever forgot.
A local priest and former World War I army chaplain took control at the ambush scene and made what locals considered a very wise decision.
So Father Sandy O'Sullivan, he came on the scene to I suppose, offer the last rites, but also very cleverly he kind of gathered the local people with ass carts, and he kind of told the people, bring soldiers on the ass carts and bring them to the Sacred Heart Church in Milltown. Respectfully, he'll call it, you know. And the commanding officer of the Black and Tan said there would have been reprisals and they would have burned the town that night. But he said that your parish priest respectfully got the dead soldiers and brought them to the Sacred Heart Church. So there was no burning or kind of, there was no reprisals.
Catherine Collery seldom spoke of the circumstances of her husband's death.
I suppose we never talked to my grandmother much about it, and she didn't speak much about it, you know, so, you know, we wouldn't have asked either because it wasn't something we knew. Our grandfather had died in an ambush, but that was all. I mean, you regret these things in later years that you didn't ask the questions at the time, but it must have had a terrible effect on her, and that she had to leave her house pretty soon afterwards because the house went with the job. So, I mean, she was very much on her own then, and with no resources of her own, you know, that she had to apply for her pension, and she got an award of £5,000, I think, from the state for you know, her loss, if you like. But that wasn't very much to, you know, bring up 8 children.
Her father's death deeply affected her daughter, also Catherine, who was 11 at the time.
But she remembered going to school, where they lived, and like I told you, the body's been brought back, and that made her cry every time she mentioned it, you know, that it just brought back that terrible memory of all that. And she was very bitter about it all, you know, that she wouldn't ever have forgiven anybody for what they did, if you like, you know, so it's nice to have kind of moved on another generation.
Until his wife's death 50 years later, James Collery's grave had no headstone.
Because he was in the RSE, I think they were afraid that if there was any headstone or marking that the grave would be damaged or desecrated or something like that. So there was no marking. We knew there was a tree, which I think is still here, growing, and that was how we knew where to come.
Just a few miles away at Ballymacandy is the derelict farmhouse where members of the ambush party waited for the patrol to arrive. And it's here that Mary O'Neill and Dermot Cotter have agreed to meet.
It's an uncomfortable place, but it would also be an emotional place.
They had only met once, briefly before our interview, after Dermot visited Sergeant Collery's grave.
I think we were both a bit sort of dumbstruck. We weren't quite sure what to say to each other initially. But, you know, we kind of felt, well, we're the next generation.
I only learned of his name a week ago. So I suppose I would hope that my grandfather would have been proud that I paid the respects by coming to the grave of Sergeant Collery 100 years after the event. And I suppose it's important to put the family and the faces and the personalities involved. He certainly would hope now that they're all resting in peace. And I suppose that these conversations will have to happen if the reality of United Ireland is that to come true, because that's ultimately what they were fighting for at that particular time. They had to do what they had to do. It's easier for us, I suppose, but as I say, we have to acknowledge that the personalities kind of hurt on all sides at the time.
Coming to the actual spot, you can kind of picture in your head the men hiding in the ditches, and I suppose maybe they'd inform us, telling them where the patrol was and when to expect it, and, you know, that kind of horrible feeling of, you know, something terrible going to happen.
I suppose we're at the spot 100 years ago where my grandfather and his comrades would have came from the lanes and streets of Kerry, and he would have taken the fight up to the British. Well, I suppose I'd be very proud of my grandfather's Republican past. And they had to do what they had to do.
But I suppose I'm coming maybe from the other side, that I'm proud of my grandfather, so, you know, it's the other side of the coin. It's difficult, but I think it's good to meet Dermot and to accept it, and, you know, to say, well, that's what happened, and people were in a situation at the time that they didn't really expect to be in, and they did what they thought they had to do.
I asked them both whether they would still leave this site with very different perspectives.
Well, I suppose that's natural that we're coming from different places. Miss Mary, you want to add to that?
Well, it's not that I wouldn't be, you know, a Republican, if you like, but it's just, I think it's important to keep the RIC memory alive, and we would, you know, be very keen on not forgetting any of them. They've been tarred with that broad brush of the atrocities that were committed by the Black and Tans, the auxiliaries.
Where the ambush happened is an unlikely spot. There's no elevated attack site, for example, and the road is straight. Dozens of IRA men had hurriedly gathered here when they got news of the patrol's route. They had the crucial advantage of surprise. It's remarkable that any of the patrol survived at all.
It meant for those who came under attack or under fire that there were fewer options or fewer possibilities to escape and to hide. Seven of them did get away eventually from the scene. Some of them heading towards the Killarney Road on the Milltown side and eventually making their way back to Killorglin. Some of the injured who had sustained various injuries in the ambush managed to find their way to the railway line. And even when the first fatalities occurred, which were quite early, District Inspector McCaughey and Sergeant Collery were killed almost immediately, one by a bullet wound and the other by shrapnel from a grenade. But if the conflict went on for 30-45 minutes, my reading of it is that, you know, there was an effort to, if you like, take out as many of these men as possible.
So it was just pure luck that the RSA men escaped?
I think so, because the IRA came out on the road at either end and effectively ensnared the police. So their only option then was to enter the fields or enter the ditches, or to try and get out at either end of the ambush zone, which was impossible. They were effectively entrapped.
As a military operation planned at short notice, the Ballymacandy ambush was a risky but successful one, and there were no IRA deaths.
In terms of an ambush, and you know, by all reckonings, they were not military trained. So, you know, they were looking at what would work and what wouldn't work. As it happens, the principles of laying an ambush were very much adhered to here, because the first principle is surprise. And this was a very surprising place to lay an ambush. It was essential that there was surprise control, and then the biggest element and the most dangerous element is not to have the soldiers firing on themselves. The people were laying the ambush, so it was important to have that coordination.
Sean O'Keefe's grandfather, Tom O'Connor, was the IRA commander who held fire until the patrol was bunched together in a confined area. It's not exactly clear why they were no longer spaced out in pairs as they had been.
They were keeping space all the way from Tralee out, and that was important because that would have been essential from their point of view to have some form of tactical spacing. But in this situation, there's one report that one of the bicycles broke down. There's another report that
they were caught behind a horse and cart.
Caught behind a horse and cart. So
yeah.
it made, in a tragic way, the Blackentans and the RIC to bunch up, which made it a lot easier for the ambush organisers to attack. Passions were high, so I would imagine once the ambush started, there was danger for everybody.
Tom O'Connor became a high-profile figure in the War of Independence, but he didn't speak much about Ballymacandy.
My grandmother was also in Cumnaman, and she would tell the stories. She would talk if you would let her, and we were probably too young at that stage to really be interested to hear the stories.
It was only in later years that Sean O'Keefe discovered his grandfather's full role during the War of Independence.
Funnily enough, I was stationed in Calrua Barracks beside Military Archives, and I asked the archivist, could I see my grandfather's file? He said, yeah, just give me his name and his date of birth. And I went over and I read the file. And that was the first time that I actually saw a first-hand account of his involvement. Previously, we'd heard stories and we'd read small bits in various books, but nothing written by the person itself. And it was very, very moving. We as a nation have grown up to accept what went on, and you know, there are versions of history that you have to look at, and by studying as many as you can, you formulate your own opinion, and it's not any one side of the story. This is history as it was. You need to take into context what was happening at that time, and 1921 martial law was declared in Kerry in particular, so there was an awful lot going on, and you also have to look at the lists of young men who signed up to be a part of that war. And in that situation, you know, they were fighting essentially for their freedom.